In 1911, a group of progressive reformers radically changed how politics in California was done, introducing direct democracy. Republican Hiram Johnson, then governor of the state, celebrated this change, saying, "The cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy." But what did he mean by this, and how did this shift impact California politics and the politics of the United States more broadly? We normally contrast direct democracy with the system of representative democracy that defines most political systems today. In a representative democracy, like the system we use across the United States, citizens elect representatives who then make policy decisions on their behalf. The public does not generally vote directly on laws, but rather selects officials to do so. Participation by citizens in the process of governance takes place primarily through the election of those representatives, perhaps trying to influence the political process through lobbying, petitions, public commentary, and so on. Representative democracy is generally seen as a practical compromise for large, complex societies, permitting representative institutions like legislatures to mediate diverse interests based on greater knowledge about specific issues. However, representative democracy can also lead to a disconnect between the public desires and legislative action, creates greater potential for corruption or influence by special interests, and may reduce citizen involvement in decision-making. In a system of direct democracy, by contrast, policy decisions are made directly by the citizens without intermediaries. This is typically done through referendums, initiatives, and sometimes public assemblies where citizens vote on laws and policies. Direct democracy requires the active and continuous participation from citizens in the decision-making process. Ancient Athenian democracy is often cited as an example of direct democracy, but in modern times, some Swiss cantons and some U.S. states, including California, practice forms of direct democracy for some policy making. Direct democracy is intended to promote higher levels of citizen engagement and representation, and policies that more directly reflect the public's will. At the same time, direct democracy can be impractical for large populations or for making difficult policy decisions. It may also lead to a tyranny of the majority, where majority rule overlooks or overrules minority rights. And it's the respective strengths and limits of each of these systems that California's mix of representative democracy in the state legislature and executive, and direct democracy through initiative, referenda, and recall seeks to address. Let's explore the primary mechanisms of direct democracy in more detail. And let's start with the less frequently used referenda, which permit voters in the state of California to approve or reject laws passed by the state legislature. In some situations, referenda are mandatory. That is, certain types of laws, particularly those involving constitutional amendments, some bond measures, and proposals to amend previously approved voter initiatives, may require a mandatory referendum. In these cases, the law must be ratified by the voters before it can take effect. Popular referendum, also called petition referendum, are triggered when citizens collect enough signatures to challenge a law passed by the legislature. Upon successful petition, the law is put on hold and must be voted on by the public. If the referendum fails, the law is repealed. Neither mandatory nor popular referenda are frequent in California, but some notable examples of recent referenda include Proposition 25 in 2020, which was a popular referendum on Senate Bill 10 and asked voters to approve a proposal to replace cash bail with a system based on public safety and flight risk. The measure was rejected by voters, which meant that the law to eliminate cash bail was not implemented. Proposition 67 in 2016 was a popular referendum on Senate Bill 270, which banned single-use plastic bags at certain retailers. Voters approved Proposition 67, meaning the plastic bag ban was upheld. And Proposition 58 was a legislative referendum that sought approval to repeal Proposition 227 and allow bilingual education in public schools. Proposition 58 was overwhelmingly approved by voters, thus repealing the English-only immersion requirement for English language learners. Next are recalls. Recall elections allow voters to remove elected officials from office before the end of their term. Unlike the impeachment process in some jurisdictions, recalls in California do not require allegations of misconduct or criminal activity. An elected official can be subject to recall effort for any reason, which may include dissatisfaction with their performance or policy decisions. Recalls begin by filing a petition with the Secretary of State and then gathering signatures from registered voters. The number of required signatures is based on a percentage of the votes cast in the last election for that office. For state officials, signatures must be equal to 12% of the vote cast for the office, with certain distribution requirements across the state's counties. If enough valid and verified signatures are collected, the recall process moves forward and a recall election is scheduled, typically 60 to 80 days out. The recall ballot presents voters with two questions. The first asks whether the official should be recalled from office. The second question lists candidates to replace the official if the recall is approved. If a majority of voters vote yes on the first question, the official is recalled, and the replacement candidate with the most votes on the second question takes office. It's more common for local officials to be recalled than statewide officials, though even at statewide level, there are some high-profile examples of both successful and unsuccessful recall efforts. In 2021, Governor Gavin Newsom was the target of an unsuccessful recall effort. The recall was driven by dissatisfaction with his handling of issues such as the COVID-19 pandemic, homelessness, and immigration. However, in the recall election held in September 2021, a significant majority of voters chose not to recall Newsom, allowing him to remain in office. But in 2003, then-Governor Gray Davis was recalled from office, largely as a result of dissatisfaction over increases in the state's vehicle licensing fee and his handling of the California electricity crisis. Voters approved his recall by a 55 to 45% margin and elected Arnold Schwarzenegger, a well-known actor and Republican candidate, as his replacement. Finally, initiatives are a form of direct democracy which allows citizens to propose and vote on new laws or amendments to the state constitution. In the context of U.S. states like California, an initiative is a process that enables citizens to bypass the state legislature by placing proposed statutes and constitutional amendments on the ballot. Initiatives are used far more frequently in California than either referenda or recall. Indeed, California makes more extensive use of initiatives than any other state in the country, with voters regularly being asked to decide on a wide variety of policy issues in every election. In the 2020 election, for example, 12 initiative measures, called propositions or props for short, were presented to the voters. Prop 14 authorized the state to issue bonds to fund stem cell research. Prop 15 increased funding for public schools, community colleges, and local government services by charging a tax assessment on commercial and industrial property. Prop 16 repeals Proposition 209 of 1996 and allows for consideration of diversity as a factor in public employment, education, and contracting decisions. Prop 17 restores the right to vote after a completion of a prison term. Prop 18 allows 17-year-olds to vote in primary elections and special elections if they turn 18 by the next general election. Prop 19 changes certain property tax rules, allowing certain homeowners to transfer primary residence tax bases to replacement residencies. Prop 20 restricts parole for certain offenses currently considered as nonviolent and authorizes felony sentences for certain offenses currently treated as only misdemeanors. Prop 21 expands local government's power to use rent control. Prop 22 designated app-based drivers like those employed by Uber, Lyft, and Grubhub as independent contractors and limited the ability of the state to impose employment requirements or regulations on those employers. Prop 23 requires physicians on site at dialysis clinics and consent from the state for a clinic to close. Prop 24 expands California's consumer data privacy laws, including provisions to allow consumers to direct businesses not to share their personal information. And finally, Prop 25 was a referendum on Senate Bill 18, a 2018 law that replaced cash bail with a system based on public safety risk. The ballot measure was rejected, leaving the cash bail system in place, but it wasn't the only one. Indeed, more than half the proposed ballot measures were rejected by the voters, an outcome in line with other recent elections. The initiative process begins with the drafting of proposed laws or constitutional amendments. This is usually done by the initiative's proponents, who may be ordinary citizens or increasingly interest groups and other organizations. The language of the proposal must be clear and legally sound. Initiatives must also have a single subject. Once the initiative is drafted, proponents submit it to the Attorney General's office, which then prepares a title and summary of the proposed measure, which is used on petitions and ballots. Once it receives a title and summary, the proposal then goes to the signature gathering phase. To qualify for the ballot, proponents generally have 180 days within which they must gather a certain number of signatures from registered voters. The number of required signatures depends on whether the initiative proposes a statute or a constitutional amendment. For statutes, signatures must equal 5% of the votes cast in the last gubernatorial election. For a constitutional amendment, it's 8%. After signatures are collected, they're submitted to county election officials for verification. The county has a set period to verify the validity of signatures. If the initiative receives the required number of signatures, it qualifies for the next statewide ballot. At this point, it's usually referred to as a proposition. It's assigned a number and will then be presented to the voters in the next general or special election. The initiative is put to a vote during an election. If more than 50% of voters approve the initiative, it becomes law or amends the Constitution if applicable. For certain types of initiatives, a different threshold may be required. Once passed, the initiative becomes part of California's law or its Constitution. Depending upon the nature of the initiative, there may be additional steps to implement or integrate the new law within the existing legal and administrative framework. And once passed by the voters, initiatives can only be repealed or amended by another initiative unless the ballot measure itself provides otherwise. They are, however, subject to the same judicial review as any other law and can be challenged in the courts. And indeed, they have been extensively challenged in the courts. Since 1986, nearly 2/3 of all initiatives approved by California voters have been partially or totally struck down by the courts, especially the federal courts. There are a variety of reasons for this, but most often, approved propositions have been struck down for a lack of representation or fairness, for example, Prop 187, which denied services to undocumented immigrants. While California's system of direct democracy was intended to center political power with the people, in practice, qualifying for the ballot and winning the election is incredibly costly. Indeed, the cost of attaining signatures necessary to qualify for the ballot and the cost of the election campaign itself easily runs into the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Let's look back at the 2020 proposition measures that we previously discussed. For those measures, total spending ranged from just $1.3 to $1.4 billion spent on Prop 17 and 18, both of which dealt with the franchise, to more than $220 billion on Prop 22, the Uber driver classification initiative. This raises important questions about the cost of the process and how that permits special interests to effectively capture the initiative process. Indeed, with enough money, nearly any proposed initiative can make it on the ballot. Initiatives often involve complex legal language that can be difficult for the average voter to understand, leading to decisions based on misunderstandings. And with so many initiatives on the ballot, voters can experience overload, leading to less informed or reflexive voting, perhaps even leading to declining voter turnout. Initiatives can lead to conflicting policies, especially when multiple unrelated issues are decided simultaneously. And many initiatives mandate spending or limit revenue without considering the overall fiscal context, potentially leading to budgetary constraints and imbalances. Finally, once passed, initiatives can be hard to amend or repeal, requiring either another ballot measure or a supermajority in the legislature, depending upon the initiative. That said, despite these limits, direct democracy remains a powerful tool and a central mechanism at play in the politics of the state. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.